if you're outside DC and you're a Republican, you blame Democrats for everything that's wrong in Washington. And if you're, if you're the other party, you think the other way around. What we're saying is that it's really corporate America. Corporate America wins no matter who's in charge. They don't care if it's Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, George Bush. They're going to win either way because they've got both sides wired. So therefore, I haven't seen it as which side does better. I mean, corporate America does better because they have ins in both political parties.
Howdy, everyone. Welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma, the president of American Moment, and I'm joined by
Nick Solheim, the COO of American Moment.
And this week we have another fantastic guest for you guys. We're here live at an undisclosed location near Capitol Hill with our guest, Brody Mullins. Brody and his brother Luke wrote this fantastic new book called The Wolves of Case Street. Brody, I feel like the most under-asked question when someone's on book tour is, what is your book about and why on earth did you decide to spend hours and hours and hours writing it?
Years and years and years writing it. First of all, thank you for having me. This should be a great conversation. The book is really about two things. It's about the rise of corporate power in Washington from the 1970s to now. And it's about how lobbying has changed during that time. And we write the way we write the book is we tell stories of 4 or 5 really interesting lobbyists and their rise and falls in DC, which sort of help show, one, how companies have come to power, and 2, how lobbying has changed.
And who are those 5 lobbyists?
The first one I was going to start with is actually the last lobbyist in the book. His name is Evan Morris. I've covered lobbying in Washington for 20 or 25 years. Never had any interest in writing a book about lobbying until 2015, when I heard about a really prominent pharmaceutical lobbyist named Evan Morris, who ended up dead on a golf course. And I was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and I covered lobbying, and I was looking into how this prominent lobbyist could end up dead on this prominent golf course. And I started looking into him. And I talked to my editor. My editor said, "Hey, no matter how tragic the death of anyone is not necessarily a story for the Wall Street Journal. There needs to point to something bigger or be connected to something broader." So I started asking around and trying to figure out who this guy was and what it made him powerful. And it turns out that he was one of the wealthiest lobbyists in DC. He was one of the youngest. He was only 38 when he died, even though he headed one of the largest pharmaceutical companies, or the top lobbyist for one of the largest drug companies in DC. He was extremely wealthy and spent money lavishly. And one of the things he owned was a $300,000 mahogany wood boat. And I found out there's one company in the country that makes boats like that, a company called Hackercraft. So I called up the company, and I was trying to subtly learn about this guy, Evan Morris, started asking questions and trying not to raise any alarms. And this guy cut me off and said, I know Evan Morris, I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to anyone at the Wall Street Journal because I gave everything I have to the FBI. And I thought, whoa, if the FBI is involved, there's something going on here. So anyway, I spent about a year looking in this guy's life, and when I realized that if you trace the rise of this guy, Evan Morris, through lobbying, through corporate America, and then his tragic fall, you really learn about how Washington has changed, how lobbying has changed, how corporations came to power. So he's just one of our lobbyists, but he's our main character that we sort of follow through the whole book.
And who are the other 4?
The other 4 are Tommy Boggs, who we consider the first original lobbyist of the modern era, since
Squire Patton Boggs.
Back then it was Patton Boggs. Now Squire Patton Boggs. He was one of the most influential Democratic lobbyists of the 1970s and 80s. We then write about Black Manafort and Stone, which includes the prominent duo of Roger Stone and Paul Manafort. And they were the most influential lobbyists of the 1980s. Then we go to Tony Podesta, who I think everyone knows. His brother was John Podesta, who ran Hillary Clinton's campaign and Barack Obama and Bill Clinton before. And then we write about this guy, Evan Morris, and someone who he was in business with, a guy named Jim Kortovich. So those are our 5 characters. They're all really fascinating individuals. And as you learn their stories, we're sort of fooling people into learning how Washington's changed and how corporations got so influential.
So give us that 10,000 foot overview. I think that the public perception of lobbying is, big guy in a 3-piece suit chomping on a cigar, trading a bag of cash to a politician. Obviously, that's a bit.
Well, that is Tommy Boggs.
That's exactly what Tommy Boggs did.
The smoke-filled room came from his smoke. It was crazy to make the smoke.
He was a big cigar guy. So, maybe that's what it is in the 60s and 70s. Trace for me the history of how lobbying changes in the subsequent 60 years.
Yeah, so, you're absolutely right. So that is how lobbying used to work. And more importantly, that's how everyone thinks lobbying works today, for people outside of DC. So, we're saying through Tommy Boggs, yes, that system did work, but cozy relationships between lobbyists and lawmakers don't get the job done anymore. In my 25 or so years as a reporter, like the one thing I know for sure is that a member of Congress will do whatever it takes to get reelected. In order to get reelected, you need the support of 51% of your constituents, and lobbyists know this. So lobbyists have sort of moved from Washington to doing more work out in the states, grassroots work with businesses, with organizations like yours at times, trying to figure out how to influence public policy through their constituents in order to get the member of Congress to follow. And that's in part because reporters like me would love to write stories about how Congressman so-and-so did a favor for a donor or did a favor for a fat cat lobbyist. And members of Congress don't want those stories out there. So they're very sensitive to doing things that help their big donors and lobbyists. But they're more than willing to do whatever their constituents want. So the whole lobbying game is now taking place out in the states.
Do you find that that's just as effective as the old system used to be?
I think it would be more effective. It costs more money. It requires far more organization and people. Back in the day, you paid Tommy Boggs $100,000 and he can get you a bill or a law or a provision. Now you need to go out in the states and you're not going to every congressional district. You're saying, okay, this bill is going through the Commerce Committee or it's going through the Energy and Power Subcommittee. There's 17 members on that committee, 3 are with you, 4 are against you, 16 are undecided or whatever, and you go play in those districts. But I think it's much more effective if you can convince constituents that just support a trade policy or an immigration stance. The member's going to follow, or they lose election, and they exist to get reelected. So they're not going to happen.
So when would you put this inflection point where the DC lobby shops really recognize that the old way of doing things wasn't going to work anymore and they had to actually gin up, what is sometimes called astroturf, but otherwise grassroots support for their agenda?
So there are several inflection points along the way. Our book is not a history of lobbying, so we don't write about every major lobbying battle, but we do pick sort of points along the way. I think a really good one is the Clinton healthcare bill of 1993. To go back to our history here, Bill Clinton, Democratic president, elected in 1992. Ross Perot was in that election, so Clinton only won, I think, with 43% of the vote. So he wasn't like the most popular president of all time, but still he came into Washington in 1993 during his honeymoon period. This is the time that most presidents, pick their top agenda item and have the support of the American people to get it done. He picked healthcare. He wanted to govern as a big liberal Democrat along the lines of LBJ and FDR. Democratic presidents for 100 years had not been able to enact national health care, and he thought he could do it. Meanwhile, the landscape lined up well for him. Democrats had the House, Democrats had the Senate. A Gallup poll said that 70% of Americans didn't like their healthcare system. And the year before, 17 Senate Republicans had a national health care bill. So this looked like something pretty doable for him. Once he proposed his bill, though, the health insurance industry strongly came out against it. They basically ran a presidential campaign complete with television ads trying to convince Americans to not support the Clinton health care bill. The idea was, the polling they did said, while Americans don't like their current health care, they don't think the government should fix the problem. And that message really worked. So to give you some numbers, Bill Clinton spent about $100 million getting elected in 1992. In 1993, the health insurance industry spent about $100 million defeating his bill. And what's amazing about that moment to me is that Bill Clinton came into office in the lines of a liberal Democratic president. Once he got his butt kicked by corporate America and by the insurance industry, he switched. Remember that he had a phrase called triangulation. He was trying to be a centrist Democrat. And what Bill Clinton is known for now on the economic side is NAFTA, free trade, welfare reform, balancing the budget. He kind of became more of a centrist. I wouldn't say a Republican, but he was much more centrist and pro-business after that point. So there's a big shift in the history of the Democratic Party.
So walk me through how the sort of partisan coalitions on these things end up, or I guess slightly different question. Do you think that this new grassroots form of lobbying is more effective thematically at killing legislation than it is in getting it passed? Or do you think that that's...
I think in general, I mean, a rule of lobbying, as you know, it's just easier to kill something than to pass something. So I think with grassroots or any type of lobbying, it's easier to scare people that say this is going to change things in a bad way than it is to rally people behind something. So I think yes, it's definitely easier to it's easier to block things, and grassroots makes it even easier to block things.
Okay, so going to the partisan side of it, which side of the aisle is more lobbied up in this way, or is it pretty even across the board? Have there been variances in how this plays out in a partisan way over the years? I mean, it sounds like the first real marshaling of this kind of energy was against Clinton and Democrats when it came to the healthcare fight, but has it always been pretty balanced across the board?
I never thought of that. I think it is pretty balanced. The reason I haven't thought of it is that I don't see lobbying as a Republican or a Democratic thing. I think that one of the things we're talking about in our book is that if you're outside DC and you're a Republican, you blame Democrats for everything that's wrong in Washington. And if you're, if you're the other party, you think the other way around. What we're saying is that it's really corporate America. Corporate America wins no matter who's in charge. They don't care if it's Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, George Bush. I mean, they're going to win either way because they've got both sides wired. So therefore, I haven't seen it as which side does better. I mean, corporate America does better because they have ins in both political parties.
Do you think that's still true in 2024 with Trump versus Biden? Because you've seen like a lot of these like big business guys and even in the tech world start to switch their support to Trump because they're worried about the direction of the country.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I feel like corporate America is split on this election. I think that corporate America in general doesn't like Trump because the corporations want stability. And that's a lot of times why companies have gotten in bed with Democrats and with a Biden or a Clinton or an Obama, because they know that while they may come under attack, they're not trying to undermine capitalism. It's just a little, tax increases a little bit here, a little more regulation there, but nothing really broad. Whereas with Trump, every morning you never know what he's going to be tweeting about. You never know what he's going to come after you with. The one difference is on regulations. I think companies would prefer Trump. Not because Trump is going to be so anti-regulation, but the people he puts in power are going to be anti-regulatory in general. So I think corporations are relatively split right now, but I don't see a ton of companies giving, except for the energy sector, a ton of companies giving money or running out to support Trump. I think that they've done okay under Biden and they're happy with sticking the way things are.
Are there any big examples of in recent memory of two gigantic lobbying campaigns against one another?
Yeah. So, when I first started covering lobbying, I thought the way it worked is that the government comes out with some new regulation to regulate some industry or some set of companies, and those companies that are affected by that hire lobbyists come to DC and try to block it or thwart it or change it. But the way lobbying works right now is that companies come to Washington to create rules or change the landscape to screw their competitors or help themselves. And I think that's why there's been a lot of sort of anti-corporate sentiment among conservatives in the House and the Senate, because they see that a lot of companies, the biggest companies, the Chamber of Commerce, are coming to Washington just to change the rules and kind of thwart the free market. But having said that, almost every big lobbying fight now is company against company. A really good one that we write about is when Google and Facebook and the internet economy was very young in 2012. It's hard to think of 2012, not that long ago. These were small companies, but in 2012, Google barely had a lobbying office in DC. Facebook didn't have much of a presence. Yet a lot of the bigger industries that had power in DC at that time, like Hollywood, like Rupert Murdoch, the Chamber of Commerce, pharma, saw the threat that the internet companies were creating to their big industries. And they came up with this bill called the Stop Online Piracy Act, which would require tech companies to police the content that users put on their websites for the first time. It would have slowed the growth of the tech industry in a small way. The tech companies said this is going to kill the internet, this is going to thwart the entire industry. That wasn't true, but that was sort of their lobbying pitch. Anyway, the the incumbents, the Hollywoods, spent about $100 million lobbying for that bill. At one point in the U.S. Senate, 99 out of 100 senators were in support of it, and the numbers in the House were the same. So this was going to become law. The tech companies didn't have the lobbyists, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the campaign donations, but they had their users. And what they decided was to do an online protest. I think it was January 18th, 2012. Google and hundreds, if not thousands of websites shut down for the day or for a few hours and put up a little logo that said, call your member of Congress, tell them this bill is going to kill the internet, and tell them to not support it. And within hours, millions of Americans called their members of Congress or emailed them, and that bill was dead within 24 hours. The bill that had its sort of 99 of 100 senators was dead 2 days later. So that was a big moment when, one, companies realized the value of grassroots and their users, but also realized that's also when big tech became big tech.
So I think big tech as a story of how modern lobbying works is really interesting, because they went from basically being unmanned here in Washington, D.C. to being the biggest players. Map out the landscape for me a little bit today. Is it true that the biggest lobbying players are these big tech companies, and what does their infrastructure here in D.C. look like?
Yeah, I mean, I told you before, our book is about these 5 characters. I forgot to say that we have 2 chapters on the rise of Google. That's because you can't write a book about the power of corporate America and not have Google. I mean, Google is the biggest, baddest lobbying machine here, and they do everything. They have traditional lobbyists. They give campaign donations. They have people outside of DC. They ran this campaign to shut down the Internet Day. They do it all. They fund academic research, and if you look at, and they fund third parties, and you look at how they've done. There's 2 or 3 big antitrust cases against Google, but nothing has, or 3, I guess, or 4 if you include the FTC in 2012. They have blocked every major attack against them. There's bills in Capitol Hill for a decade to rein in Google and big tech. They have gone nowhere. There's this child protection acts last week that were killed magically. We'll figure out exactly what happened, but I'm sure Google was behind it. So I mean, they have won every single battle, and it's because they're just so powerful.
So explain how exactly this works. For instance, there is only a certain number of actual registered lobbyists in DC. What's that actual number?
It's 11 or 12,000.
Okay. That is not
Correct.
the total headcount of people working to support corporate interests in DC. How do they get away with keeping that headcount artificially low?
So what's fascinating is that the definition of lobbying or lobbyist is someone who spends 20% or more of their time actually talking to policymakers or lawmakers to change public policy on behalf of a paying client. And that definition is supposed to catch anyone who's in the advocacy.
On behalf of a paying client, most important.
Yes,
right?
a paying client.
So if someone has 6 clients that they're splitting their time between, doesn't count.
There's all sorts of loopholes here. But the biggest loophole is 20% of your time.
Yeah.
Even lobbyists who say, I'm a lobbyist, spend all my time talking to members of Congress, trying to talk to someone for a full day out of a week is a lot. So no one goes above that 20% threshold, which means that the definition is very squishy, and lots of lobbyists don't register as lobbyists. If you register as a lobbyist, you need to just fill out a form once a quarter that says, here's my name, here's my clients, here's how much money I make, and here's the general rules or issues I'm lobbying on. The idea is that lobbying is constitutionally protected. People have the right to petition their government. No one's saying that lobbying is illegal. But what you need to do is disclose what you're doing. And so many lobbyists or so many people in the advocacy world don't fill out those forms because they say they're beneath that threshold. So a good example is if you remember the Jack Abramoff lobbying scandal in the 2000s, it was a big lobbying corruption scandal. He went to jail. Congress responded to that by passing a lobbying reform bill. That lobbying reform bill said that lobbyists can't buy gifts or anything of value for a member of Congress. You can't bring them to can't play golf with them. You can't buy a steak dinner or a glass of wine or go on a golf trip or a fundraising trip. So what happened instead was all these lobbyists decided, well, I'm not a lobbyist, and they started not registering anymore. So that number, 11 or 12,000, has been consistent since 2007. So as the lobbying and influence world has boomed in the last 15 years, if you look at the actual official statistics, it's flatlined, and there's just no way that's true.
Who has to? I mean, why is anyone actually a registered lobbyist?
That's a good question. I mean, some people just want to play it safe. I mean, I know lobbyists who say, I register my secretary or their young staff as lobbyists who never go to Capitol Hill because those people spend all their days compiling information to be used in lobbying meetings, or they're setting up calls, or they're setting up meetings. So they think that they could fall under that definition. To be safe, they register their staff. On the flip side, I remember one time I looked at the top 50 business trade associations in DC, the Chamber of Commerce, Pharma, Bio, those guys. And I looked at all their presidents and I ran through the lobbying database to see who's registered. And about 50% of those folks were so people whose job it is to come to Washington, D.C. to lobby are not registered lobbyists. And that's probably because they don't actually talk to members of Congress. But it just shows how much wiggle room there is in this statute.
And how's a typical lobbying firm organized today? I mean, what do these shops actually look like? Feels like, there's a lot of think tanks that, get thrown around as sort of household names, maybe even out in the country, but I don't feel like people know lobbying firm names as widely.
Yeah. So it's actually fairly scientific. A typical lobbying shop will have a lead lobbyist for House Republicans, for Senate Republicans, for Senate Democrats, and I think they take all four sides and they have one person for each, and then each of those teams will have people underneath them supporting them. Bigger, more advanced lobbying shops will have a lobbyist for the CBC or for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus or for conservative groups or for people on the farm, people who are interested, like the Ag Committee or the Chamber of Commerce or the Energy and Commerce Committee. So the bigger you are, the more specialized you can get, and you can have like one or two lobbyists for every sort of subgroup on the Hill.
The CBC is a really interesting example. I never really understood what the Congressional Black Caucus and their role in Washington was until one day I went to their website and saw that they have these massive programs to help support staff and stuff like that. And, every single one of those fellowships has a, Exxon sponsored fellow or a, Pharma sponsored fellow and stuff. Explain the role that the CBC and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus actually play in this ecosystem and how corporate America utilizes them.
Well, so another way that companies can get access to members of Congress, and it's not just the Hispanic Caucus and the Black Caucus, those are good examples, is these groups have foundations. And while companies under the McCain-Feingold law of 2002 are not allowed to make big unlimited campaign donations to the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee, they can give to nonprofits. And the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and the Congressional Black Caucus are both nonprofit organizations and can accept big donations from companies. So big companies know a way to get access or a way to curry favor with some of these groups is to make $1 million donations or $50,000 donations. So all these groups are heavily funded by corporate America. Now that money technically can't go to a member of Congress, but the members of Congress know who's giving to support their,
and they benefit significantly from it.
And also from trips they do or fundraising that they do around the country that can be underwritten by these big companies.
Is there any appetite for closing some of these loopholes in the system?
The answer is no. I
assume that would be the case.
Yeah. I think one thing that might change in the next couple of years is that, lawmakers are the people who make the laws, obviously. And the way that the campaign finance system is set up right now, because of the 2002 McCain-Feingold law, is that companies, corporate America, and unions and individuals are not allowed to make large campaign contributions, $1 million contributions to the political parties. But billionaires are allowed to give money to C4s or to super PACs or to outside campaign groups. So it seems like more and more when members of Congress are running for re-election, the money that they get is limited by the FEC rules. The money they can get from the political party is limited, but billionaires and super PACs can do whatever they want. So it seems the more money that gets in the system from billionaires through outside groups and super PACs, and the less money that candidates are getting, we're setting up a system here where candidates are increasingly not the biggest voice in their own campaigns, and the political parties are not the strongest force in campaigns. And I think that's a problem. And I think at some point, members of Congress are going to realize that, say, why does that billionaire have more say over my election than I do? And if that happens, I could see a loosening of the rules to allow political parties to accept big donations again. That's sort of a prediction, but I could see that happening.
And that was something McConnell always wanted, right?
He said it right away. He was the first person to say this McCain-Feingold law is going to end up putting policy exactly what it is right now.
Yeah.
No one listened to him at the time, but
Right.
he was right.
So explain a little bit about how the kind of influence peddling game works through C3s and C4s and even academia, because that's the side of it that I've seen a lot. Some friends of mine created a little Twitter bot a few years ago called Big Tech Alert or Big Tech Watch, and basically it was a plugin you could put on your browser, and when you're on Twitter, you could see if a particular academic or sort of influencer in DC was funded by big tech. These are our friends at the American Principles Project. And so you find out that a lot of the scholarship, quote unquote, and sort of ideological entrepreneurship on specific policy issues is being underwritten by corporate America that has a vested interest. How does that system work?
So, as we were saying before, lobbyists themselves have less influence over legislation when they're actually talking to members of Congress. Members of Congress don't want to do favors for their lobbying friends. But they do listen to C4s, and C4s and some of these outside groups are citizens organizations. I mean, they have members. They can have tens of thousands of supporters, or in some cases millions, and therefore they have lots of influence, lots of weight with members of Congress. A member of Congress who is looking to get reelected, could side with a big C4 who has lots of members who are going to go vote for them. But the difference is with this lobbying disclosure rule we're talking about is the lobbyist who's up on Capitol Hill is registered and disclosed. We know who that person is. The C4 is not. The people working with the C4 just seem like they're some public interest group, advocating on whatever policy, or just educating, not even advocating, just educating. I wrote a series of stories for the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago about a professor named Joshua Wright, who came across as a professor from George Mason University. He wrote scores of academic papers about antitrust policy and privacy policy that almost always benefited the tech industry. Well, it turns out that the tech industry was funding his research, had him on the payroll as a consultant, and he made, as a professor at George Mason University, he made $400,000 a year, which I find to be an insane amount of money for a professor. But he's paid $2 million on top of that by the tech industry. So while he walks around, acting like he's a professor, he's really working for big tech. It is a great scam he had going for 10 years or so.
So I'm going to ask you one more question that's going to be a little uncomfortable, and then we'll switch to audience for Q&A. So something I've been tracking for a few years, mostly because I got my start in Texas politics, was the rise of the C3 nonprofit journalism model as the primary way that especially kind of state level news outlets are trying to be funded these days. It seemed like most of the rising, more local or more issue specific papers are run precisely that way. They can take big corporate donations. And look, the alternative is that, the mainstream outlets are owned by billionaires. Time is owned by Lauren Powell Jobs, Rupert Murdoch owns the Journal, and, Washington Post is owned by Bezos and stuff. Are you seeing the green shoots of part of this influence peddling campaign by corporate America being just funding the refs in addition to every other player in the ecosystem?
I have not seen the effects of that, but that's certainly something that could happen. I personally think that Jeff Bezos doesn't really care what the Washington Post says, that he's doing it. It's such a tiny part of his overall portfolio that I don't think that he's putting his thumb on the scale. But, I could be wrong. The issue is like when I first started at the Journal, we were owned by the Dow Jones family. And it was a publicly traded company. It still is. But we had pressure from shareholders and from the stock market to cut profits or to write stories that had one slant or another to get eyeballs and make profits. When Murdoch bought the paper, that sort of went away. He never put any pressure on me or anyone else that I know of to be more conservative or to write this story or another story. In a way, I kind of thought billionaires are good because these media assets are so small in their overall portfolios that they're really buying them for the prestige. Rupert Murdoch likes saying, I own the Wall Street Journal. He wasn't putting his thumb on the scale. And if he did, that could ruin his brand that he just paid, I think, $2 or $5 billion for. So that's my opinion. I could see more billionaires buying papers. And I thought it was sort of good for our business because it removed us from the whims of stock market and shareholders and moved it more to a billionaire who just wanted it for pride.
Interesting. We have time for questions. Haviva has a mic. Raise your hand if you've got one. I see one back there.
Hi, Pat Span. I did over 42 years with federal government, military, and civilian in the IC. Not that everybody in this room knows what the IC is. But anyway, I had two questions. One is, wasn't there a law passed within the last, 10, 15 years about somebody leaving government? I don't know, I guess it wasn't Congress, but somebody leaving government had to sit for a year or two before they could work for a lobbyist. And also, why is the dealing with foreign countries? I mean, you hear people being charged with criminal offense for not listing the fact that they're lobbyists for in support of some foreign country, and it seems like it would be a little more analogous to what you're talking about.
Yeah. So what you're referring to at first is there's a cooling off period. And you're right. If a staffer leaves the employment of a senator or a member of Congress,
Senior staffer, right?
Senior staffer, they can't lobby that or contact that office for 1 year on policy matters. Every time a new president is elected, they create their own rule for the administration. I don't think there's ever been a lifetime ban, but I think Obama might have had 2 or 5 year ban on people who worked in his administration could not come back and lobby that same agency. And the second question was about foreign lobbying. I mean, foreign lobbying is getting more and more pervasive. But more importantly, until Paul Manafort, lots of people who work for foreign countries didn't properly register and disclose their activities because there's almost no enforcement of it. Paul Manafort changed that when Paul Manafort got busted by DOJ for not properly registering his activities on behalf of Ukraine or the government of Ukraine. Other lobbyists who are doing the same thing got scared and they started filing their reports for the first time. So I think there is a lot more disclosure about that, about foreign lobbying, and there's a lot more money being spent by foreign countries to influence U.S. policy.
Hey, thank you so much for your talk. I had a couple of quick questions, please. Would you say, in general, does the rise in the growth of government explain the need for lobbying? Or would you say that the rise in corporate power explains the rise in lobbying?
It was definitely the first one.
Okay.
I mean, the corporate lobbying is a response to the growth of government.
Yes, sir. And then also I was wondering, you go back to the 1960s, it sounds like in your book, did the rise in lobbying at the federal level represent in any way a shift from lobbying efforts that may have happened at the state level?
You know, I'm not sure. I think it really started with the federal government. So to go back and do a little history, we all remember the robber barons and the Standard Oil and J.P. Morgan and the Rockefellers back in the 1910s and 1920s and before. I always thought that companies are really powerful now. They were powerful back then. They must have been powerful for the entire time in between. And it turned out that was not true. That the people and the government responded to those big monopolists back then by creating the antitrust laws. The Federal Trade Commission was created in 1918, I believe, several other antitrust laws. And from that period to the 1970s, companies actually had very little influence in Washington. They didn't have lobbyists. They weren't big funders of campaigns. They didn't have offices in D.C. Companies sort of sat back and thought that it wasn't their job, it wasn't their business to get involved in government policymaking and rulemaking. And during that time, maybe it's a coincidence or not, we had the New Deal, we had Great Society with a huge growth in the size of the federal government. And for the most part, I think companies didn't really mind. They were still making lots of money. Corporate profits were up. Companies cared about their employees. You sponsor the Little League team. And things changed in the 1970s. In the 1970s, we had stagflation and inflation. Corporate profits evaporated. And companies looked around and said, what's the problem? Where do my profits go? And they realized it's the government. And at that point, companies for the first time really started investing in Washington, and at first trying to push back government, stop new regulations, roll back existing regulations. And I think now it's more companies coming to Washington proactively to create regulations, to create rules that are barriers to entry to their competitors.
I had a question I wanted to throw in here. So someone who seems to have tried to speed run the influence peddling game was Sam Bankman-Fried. He went from 0 to 60, being one of the biggest players throwing money around this town. What did that story tell you about how this ecosystem functions right now? If he had been slightly more careful, would he have been able to hack it as well as it seemed like he was going to?
I think he needed to be more careful, but I also think the lesson is, and more and more companies are learning this or have learned this in the last few decades, you got to start early. You can't start when there's a crisis. One of the things we write about in our chapters on Google is that Google learned from the mistakes that Microsoft made. Microsoft is a little before our time, but in the 1970s and 1980s, they were the biggest computer company, software company in the world. Bill Gates thought that he was the smartest person in the world, that his company had the smartest engineers, and I think that was true. But they didn't want Washington anywhere near them. They said, Washington should not be regulating us, and that worked for a long time. But then eventually, the company got so big that the DOJ and 30 states or so filed antitrust lawsuits against them. Microsoft eventually prevailed, but for 10 years, they were caught up fighting the DOJ in these states in these antitrust cases. So they spent billions of dollars on dealing with lawyers, dealing with Washington, and more importantly, not focusing on what they should be focused on, which is doing business, running their business, starting inventing new products. When Google came to Washington, they said, when Google was founded, they said they wanted to be the next Microsoft. They wanted to be the biggest, baddest company in the country. But in order to do that, they needed to watch Washington. So unlike Microsoft, they hired lobbyists, sent them to DC to kind of keep track of what was going on in Washington. And what's interesting is that, Microsoft ended up getting sued by the Justice Department for being a monopoly. Again, they defeated those charges, but Google blocked the FTC from even starting an investigation. In 2011, 2012, the Federal Trade Commission was gearing up an antitrust lawsuit against Google, and Google had its lobbyists everywhere and beat that, saving the company, the hundreds of millions of dollars in legal fees and time spent focused on that lawsuit. So at the point to answer the question then is, I think it would have worked had he started 10 years earlier.
Yeah.
But he kind of once you're in crisis,
it's 16 years old, 10 years earlier. Yeah.
5 years earlier.
Relatedly, what has the AI fight over the last 18 months or so told you about how this ecosystem works? It seems like, going back to your earlier point about how the traditional mode of lobbying was come to DC to defeat regulation, Sam Altman came to DC and said, Mother May I, please give me regulatory structure. It was extraordinarily contrite. I actually thought it was clever, albeit bad for the country, the way he arrived in Washington and operated. What is that story?
I think we'll see. So I have two answers. I don't know what's going to happen here, but I think that they're doing the right thing. Those companies are the Microsofts and Google, so they have learned the lesson through prior battles to come here. I think what they've also seen through tech is that the government has actively been trying to go after tech for 10 years or 12 years. The country, Republicans and Democrats, have turned against tech, and Congress can't get its act together to do anything about it. And the tech companies know that, which is why Mark Zuckerberg says, regulate me. I'm open. Let's do it. And he knows that Congress can't get the job done.
I get YouTube ads about it. Please regulate us from Facebook. Yeah.
I think that's the same idea. Then you sort of say that knowing there's no way these clowns can get their act together. And it's true.
Yeah. More questions? Here, Frime.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak to us. I was wondering to what extent lobbying in DC is a product of the information problem. Congressmen have limited staffs, they have very limited budgets, and you can't know everything about every subject. And so when someone comes to your office and says, hi, I'm an expert on the oil industry, let me tell you about it, you're willing, regardless of donations, regardless of any other factors, to hear this guy out. And if he's the only one making a case, well, you're going to be inclined to take his side.
Yeah, no, I think that's a large part of it. I mean, I don't disagree with that at all. What we write about in our book is that the founders of the country foresaw that there would be lobbying, there would be interest groups battling each other. They thought that it would be a consumer or worker group or faction or interest groups against a industry faction. They sort of be equal size. They would battle each other to compromise. What we have now is that public interest groups are not as powerful in DC right now. Environmental groups are not as powerful. Labor unions are in the toilet. Labor unions were the consumer, the worker faction. So that when members of Congress now say, hey, let me learn about a new issue, let's go talk to the experts. The only experts out there are working for companies. It used to be that you would talk to Ralph Nader, you talk to the company, you talk to an environmental group, you talk to all sorts of different people, then you'd form your own opinion. Now you're going to AT&T and Verizon to figure out, what your policy on telecommunications is. And that's where the problem is.
More questions? Up here.
Thank you for coming to speak with us tonight. So we've talked a lot about corporate lobbying being sort of a negative force, that they're stopping something. But what about corporate lobbying being a constructive force in a way? So what do you make of the idea that you might be able to try and organize, say, the baby product companies to get something like family policy, because that would indeed give them lots of rents?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that I think there are some companies and industries that do sort of think about changing policies in a way that give them business down the road. The example I thought of was 10 or 15 years ago, I was trying to write about one of the big anti-kid smoking organizations. I forget the name of them. They were funded by Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson made the biggest smoking cessation products. It's sort of like the same idea. You're kind of funding an issue because you support it on the back end. A better example might be the main lobbyist we read about in our book, Evan Morris, worked for a company called Genentech. Genentech makes Tamiflu. Tamiflu is the leading treatment for the flu. So before we had the 2020 pandemic, we had there was a worry about the avian flu in 2008, 2009, I believe it was. No, it was 2007, 2008. And Evan Morris went out and ginned up local news stories and got Americans worried about the avian flu. He then got those worries and sort of amplified those worries in Washington. All of a sudden, 32 U.S. senators wrote a letter to the Bush administration saying, hey, we should create a stockpile of medications for the avian flu. And the senators we got, by the way, weren't no names. It was Hillary Clinton, Senator Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and it was bipartisan. And so the Bush administration responded and said, this is a great idea. So they created a $2 billion fund of anti-bird flu vaccinations. And then Evan Morris said, oh, I make Tamiflu. We should probably buy Tamiflu. And they did. So to this day, the government has a $2 billion stockpile of Tamiflu. And he made up this crisis in order to sell his product, and it worked.
That's kind of amazing. It feels like the most beat up industry in Washington for the last 40 years has been the tobacco industry. Some say that's a good thing. I would disagree. The tobacco industry was seen as one of the core patrons of the right for many, many years. But also it seems like they've kind of just failed in every iteration that they've existed in. First, when it came to the labeling fights, then when it came to the age of smoking permission, even the new kids on the block, Juul, got smacked down in a big way. Does the industry talk about this as a case study of how not to do things, and what lessons can we learn about the efficacy of lobbying from it?
I think that they may use a case study of how things work. I mean, yes, they lost, but how many years do they delay, those regulations? How many years do they push back advertising, labeling? And now the tobacco companies are working overseas. They see the market in the U.S. going down, they're working overseas. But the whole idea is that, governments looking at health records, looking at health data, are eventually going to try to put your product out of business. How long can you just keep it on the market? That's another thing that Evan Morris did, actually, was try to, when the FDA was trying to ban some of his company's products, he just tried to gum up the works, slow down the FDA. So instead of the FDA taking 6 months to ban a product or rescind an approval, it took a year and a half. And in the meantime, you make $1 billion. So, I'd have to read more about the tobacco industry, but I feel like the donations they've made in DC in slowing down the regulations, I think they could see it as a win.
More questions? Back there.
Yeah, how would you rate the TikTok lobbying attempt on the bill to not ban it but force a sale? I mean, it seemed like they were coming at it from a sort of split situation, and then when they tried the grassroots campaign, like Google did successfully in 2012, it backfired bigly.
Yeah, so that's a great question because I talk a lot about this Google example, and then TikTok did the same thing and they got their butts kicked. So, what is the difference? I mean, maybe, so TikTok reached out to 9 million of its users and had 9 million people call members of Congress. And I would have thought, looking at the Google model, that would work. Instead, it failed. And
Turns out more is not better.
right. Well, maybe it was that of the 9 million people who called their members of Congress, they were all like 13-year-old girls, including my daughters.
My phone doesn't work. Why is it not? Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, maybe it's the China element of it that scares people. Maybe members of Congress are wary that they're being used by a lobbying tactic like that. I'm really not sure. I don't have a good answer.
More questions up here?
Hey, really enjoyed the talk. A question I had is you mentioned that a lot of lobbying nowadays has shifted more into the states, into the districts, instead of, these dark smoke back rooms. It's more grassroots activism. Do you find that effective? A strategy I think of is, and also how does that work? Like, go a little bit deeper into that. One thing I think of recently is the New York primary, where like AIPAC affiliated groups got really deep into that state, and a lot of attack ads. Is that the strategy where people go, or is it more like grassroots support? Like, how does that?
I think in general, it's more subtle and it's grassroots. It's less of what AIPAC did, but there are, groups like AIPAC need to worry about there being a backlash of them being so aggressively out on a campaign issue like that. But there are good examples. Back to Google and Facebook. The story that I heard is that Nancy Klobuchar had this anti-tech bill in the Senate that had lots of support on her committee, maybe not a majority, but she was trying to get a Senate floor vote. She kept going to Chuck Schumer to try to get floor time, and Google went out, or Google front group went out into the states with a bunch of people on her, vulnerable members on her committee, and ran huge ads saying, don't support the Klobuchar bill, blah, blah, blah. And what they were doing is sending a message to those members of Congress that they have unlimited budgets. And if those senators vote for the bill on the floor, they're going to come after them and crush them. And Schumer never called for a vote on that legislation. I think it was because those committee members said, I can't take the heat for voting against Google on these. So, but I think that's rare, but does happen. I think it's more, what happens more regularly is that companies basically run presidential campaigns or congressional campaigns in a district, not for a candidate, but for a product. So a good example is, what are these ads now sponsored by Pharma on prescription drug benefit managers? You follow these ads?
Yeah, PBS.
Yeah, PBS. That's one industry against another industry fighting it over in a sort of campaign style tactics in issue ads, trying to build support among the public to get members of Congress to follow.
Up here.
Thank you. I hope we've all seen the classic Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. If you were to write, say, a companion volume, who would be the profiles and courage in Washington in the context of this industry?
That's a tough one because your profiles and courage are not in Congress, right? I don't know if there are good examples like that right now. I mean, members of Congress just want to get reelected, and therefore they can't vote against corporate America.
Well, so let me reframe that question then. Who are the biggest scalps of the lobbying industry? Like, who tried to go up against a powerful lobby and is no longer in Washington because of it?
Yeah, there are lots of good examples. Why can't I think of them right now? I'm gonna have to get back to you on that one. I can't think of one right now. And I think that's oftentimes because there aren't votes. I mean, the Democratic leaders need to keep their Democrats in power, and Republican leaders need to keep their Republicans in power. So the Republican Democrats who would be the profiles and courage go to their members and say, don't make me vote on this, I'm going to lose, and therefore there's no vote. Let me give you a really good example. In the 2016 election, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, and every single congressional Democrat talked about how all they're going to do if if Biden won, was to rescind the Trump corporate tax cuts. Not every day, lots of ads are about rescinding the $1.3 trillion corporate tax cut bill. Biden won. Democrats had the House. Democrats had the Senate. And there was never even a vote on it. They never even had a vote. Like, it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to vote and we lost. Well, we tried. They didn't even vote on it. And that's because Democrats in tough districts, Democrats who would lose their seats if they voted for the tax cut, said, don't let me vote on this. So there was no votes. So I think that shows why there's no profiles in courage, because there's no votes.
Very interesting. Questions up here?
So you mentioned that the growth and expansion of big government preceded the corporate influence in lobbying. Given that the size of our government is unlikely to decrease any time soon, do you have any hopes for a return to corporations being much less involved in internal politics?
I mean, the hope or the silver lining is what we're seeing now, I think, on antitrust and on mergers and at the FTC and DOJ, where more and more populist Republicans are saying these companies have gotten too big and need to be reined in. Lena Khan is obviously leading the charge at the Federal Trade Commission to rein in big companies. And you see that she's gotten support from House Republicans and Senate Republicans. There was a bill that passed Congress a year and a half ago that would tax companies that are merging, increase the merger fees on companies that are merging, give that money to the Federal Trade Commission and to the DOJ, whose job to hire more people to review mergers, as in take money from corporations, give it to the government to block mergers. That's something that Democrat field day. 39 House Republicans voted for that, like 39. That's 39 Republicans saying, I want the government to be bigger and stronger, have more resources to look into corporate mergers. That's insane, but that's how we are right now. And when I say insane, I meant for a traditional Republican Party, that would not happen. And in the Senate, there's 4, 5, or 6 or 7 populist senators who I think are doing the same thing. Josh Hawley, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Marsha Blackburn, a couple others. So there does seem to be, every election we seem to have a Rob Portman. When a Rob Portman leaves, the traditional Chamber of Commerce, Reagan Republican, when they leave, a J.D. Vance comes in, and the party seems to be kind of slowly moving in that direction.
This part will be just for our live audience and our members on YouTube. But we always like to ask our guests that come on the show to basically predict out into the future. There's 2 things that I'm really curious about. The first is, Brody, thank you for joining us today. Where can people keep up with your work and everything you have coming?
Yeah, so I'm mainly on Twitter at Brody Mullins DC, and then, just working on my book and book promotions. So thanks for coming, and it's good to talk.
Thank you. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier, Jared Cummings, Tiffany Kutris, and Matthew Pearson. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is americanmoment.org.